Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to go back in time a bit to the early 1970s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a pretty intense time, honestly. A lot of social change happening and, unfortunately, some serious unrest, too. We're diving into the story of Neal Long.
Neal Long.
Yeah, the shotgun slayer who terrorized Dayton, Ohio.
Oh, wow. I think I've heard that name before. Not the details though.
Yeah, this deep dive is especially interesting because, well, we're not just talking about a serial killer. We're also looking at the time and place it all happened. A city dealing with desegregation and the racial tensions that came with it.
Makes sense, yeah. So, what do we have to go on here?
Well, let's see. We've got some old newspaper articles from back then, excerpts from Long's Wikipedia page, which is always an interesting read,
Oh, yeah.
and even some court documents.
Court documents. Cool.
Let's see what we can find out, shall we?
Absolutely. This is going to be good.
I know, right? So, okay, this Neil Long guy, he seems like he lived a totally normal life for a while before, becoming the shotgun slayer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Born in Kentucky in 1927, moved to Dayton in 1944, got married, had 7 kids. Normal stuff, right?
Yeah, pretty average.
It's like, how does someone with a life like that end up, down that path?
Right. It's almost like he was living this double life.
Yeah, like everyone always says, he was such a quiet guy.
Exactly. We never suspected a thing.
But there had to be something, some cracks in that facade.
You would think so, yeah.
And our sources seem to show that those cracks really start to show in the mid-60s.
Okay.
He started showing signs of mental illness
Uh-huh.
and also violent behavior, specifically targeted towards black people.
Oh, wow.
There's even this incident in 1966. He just walks into a police station and says he stabbed a black man in self-defense.
Whoa.
But here's the thing. The police couldn't find any record of it happening at all.
So he just made it up?
We don't know. It makes you wonder what was going on in his head. Was this like a twisted cry for help, or was he trying to, justify something he'd already done?
That's spooky.
Right. I mean, what if someone had looked into it more back then?
Yeah.
Could all the awful things that happened later, could they have been stopped?
It's possible, right? Like a mid-up opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. A real tragedy. But, okay, so what we do know is that around the same time, Long's getting psychiatric help. He even spent 3 months at the Dayton Mental Health Center, and they diagnosed him with psychopathic personality disorder.
Hmm?
And I wonder, how was that diagnosis seen back then? Was it like a real explanation for his actions, or did people dismiss it?
Especially considering, the racial element of the violence.
Exactly. Unfortunately, the sources don't really give us a clear answer on that.
Oh, okay.
It makes you think about how we view mental health now versus back then.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how much things have really changed?
And then there's the whole gun thing. The sources mentioned that Long loved guns. He had a whole collection.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah. Knowing that, it's not surprising things took an even darker turn. Between 72 and 75, Dayton was basically living in fear. There were all these attacks against black men.
Oh,
People
man.
patrolling the streets at night, civil rights groups demanding the police do something.
Wow.
They even offered a $10,000 reward for information.
A lot of money back then.
Oh yeah, but nobody knew who was doing it.
So the police were just totally stumped.
At first, yeah, they couldn't find a pattern, a suspect, anything. They even asked the FBI for help, but they said no initially.
What? Why?
I don't know, but can you imagine the fear in the city? Especially for the black community?
Yeah, being targeted like that, absolutely terrifying.
It was like something out of a movie. And then there's this huge turning point. September 19th, 1975.
Okay, what happened?
Neal Long walks into a federal building and just shoots Dr. Charles Glatt, a sociologist working on desegregation busing programs.
Wait, so he targeted him specifically?
Yeah, Dr. Glatt wasn't just some random guy. He was trying to peacefully integrate schools.
So Long saw him as a threat.
Exactly. It's crazy how much desegregation was being fought back then.
Yeah, Dr. Glatt was probably a hero to some, right?
And a target to those who hated integration, like Long.
It's really awful.
And the craziest part, it was killing Dr. Glatt that finally got him caught.
Really?
The guards grabbed him right there in the building.
So after all the mystery, it ends with this really public act.
Right. It makes you think, did he want to get caught? Was this like his final horrific statement?
It's hard to know for sure, but I guess his capture had to be a relief for Dayton.
Oh, yeah. The start of a long and painful healing process. But his story isn't over. We still have to talk about what he said after he was arrested.
His confession.
Exactly, his confession.
I'm kind of nervous to hear this, but I guess we gotta know.
Oh, yeah? It's chilling stuff.
So, about that confession,
Yeah, it was pretty bad.
just how bad are we talking here?
Well, he admitted to like 25 to 30 attacks on black people.
Wow.
And his reasoning was just his hatred for desegregation.
Ugh, that's awful. So he was just like completely consumed by this racism.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think that this confession, it didn't just solve the whole shotgun slayer thing, but it also might connect him back to that murder in '66.
Lester Mitchell.
Yeah, the one that caused all those riots in Dayton. And remember that stabbing he talked about? The one the
Yeah.
police couldn't confirm?
Yeah, yeah, I remember.
It's like you start to see this pattern of violence escalating.
Yeah, definitely. And, thinking about it from a historical perspective, it really shows how these individual acts of violence can have a much bigger impact. Like those riots in 66, they weren't just isolated events, they were part of this huge nationwide tension over civil rights.
Right, like the fight for equality was still really fresh then.
Exactly. And there was a lot of pushback, especially in cities like Dayton, that were changing so fast.
So you're saying Long's actions, while horrific, were also kind of a symptom of what was going on in society at the time.
Yeah, in a way, individual prejudices don't just appear out of nowhere. They're influenced by, like, the bigger picture, the social and historical context. In Long's case, his hatred was all tied up with his resistance to desegregation.
He saw it as a threat.
Totally. He thought integration would cause chaos, lead to violence against white people.
It's scary how relevant that still feels today, you know?
Yeah, sadly. But getting back to Long, what happened after his arrest, after he confessed to everything?
Well, I mean, with all the evidence in his confession, the trial wasn't really about proving he was innocent. It was more about what kind of punishment he deserved.
Makes sense. So what did they decide?
Well, he actually decided to plead guilty.
He did.
Yeah, to multiple murders, including Dr. Glatz, both in federal and state courts. It kind of surprised everyone.
Why would he plead guilty? Seems like a strange move.
From what I understand, he was trying to avoid the death penalty,
Ah, yeah.
which, I mean, given what he did, was a very real possibility.
Right. So he basically traded a possible death sentence for life in prison.
Exactly. And it makes you think about, even with a case this clear-cut, the legal system is still pretty complicated.
For sure. But does a life sentence really get to the root of the problem?
That's a good question. Like, it brings justice and closure, but it doesn't erase the pain for the victims, their families, the whole community, really.
You're right. Long going to prison stopped his reign of terror, but it didn't fix the fear and division he caused. His case became this symbol of, like, the deep racial wounds in Dayton and the whole country.
It's like it forced everyone to confront these really uncomfortable truths about prejudice.
Yeah, like ripping the bandage off a wound that never really healed. And even though Long died in prison back in '98, his case still makes us think. It makes us ask, how can we stop this from happening again?
It's like a warning from history. But what can we actually learn from this case? How can we apply it to today?
That's the real question, isn't it? It's time to look at the lasting impact of what he did and what it tells us about the fight for racial justice in America.
Man, this case is really heavy. Even though we've gone over so much, I keep thinking about that unsolved murder from '66. Lester Mitchell.
Yeah, it's hard not to, right? Thinking Long might be connected to it, even if it was never proven, just adds another layer to everything. Shows how deep this racial violence goes.
It makes you think about the victims, their families, how long that pain lasts. And it brings up a big question. How do we move on from something like this? As a society, I mean, how do we learn from it and stop it from happening again?
That's a tough one for sure. I think one of the biggest takeaway from Long's case is that prejudice, it doesn't just exist on its own. It's shaped by, by history, by the social context. If we really want to tackle racial violence, we have to look beyond just the individual. We have to look at the systems that cause inequality.
Right. So it's not just about saying racism is bad. We have to actively work to dismantle the systems that allow it to happen.
Exactly. We have to challenge our own biases, learn about the history of racism, and support things that promote equality for everyone. It's a constant process, and it means having tough conversations even when we're uncomfortable.
It just hit me as we're talking. Long's case, as awful as it is, it's also a chance for us to look in the mirror, to ask ourselves, are we contributing to prejudice, even unintentionally? Are we ignoring it when we see it?
That's really insightful. It's easy to look at someone like Long and say he's a monster, but the truth is the things that lead to hate and violence, those can exist anywhere, in any society, in anyone. We have to recognize that and actively fight it with empathy, with understanding, with respect.
Silence is complicity, right? We all have to do our part to make things better.
That completely agree. And that brings us to our listeners. If this case is weighing on you, remember that knowledge is power. If we understand what fuels prejudice and violence, we can challenge it in our own lives, in our communities. We can choose to be allies, advocates, people who actually make a difference.
What are some things people can do to start?
Oh, lots of things. Learn about the history of racism in your area, support groups fighting for racial justice, talk about race and privilege with your family and friends, and most importantly, hold yourself and others accountable. Make sure everyone is living up to the values of equality and respect.
Those are all great ideas. And remember, change doesn't happen overnight, right? It's a journey. And every step we take towards understanding, empathy, taking action, it brings us closer to a world where stories like Long's are just a bad memory.
Well said. Our deep dive ends here, but we hope you keep digging into this case and the issue that brings up.
There are so many resources out there, online, in libraries, even just talking to people in your community. Never stop asking questions, learning, and working for a better world. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us.